Okay, well, welcome everybody to another IOE Lunch and Learn. If it's your first time coming to these, we do them almost all Fridays throughout the academic year. And this is the last one of the semester, and it's going to be a really good one. It's an exciting topic that we have for you today. So we've got two speakers, both with connections to IOE, and both who are authors of very well-known books. So we have Professor Emeritus Jeffrey Liker, author of The Toyota Way, with us here. Many of you may have read that. Professor Liker has a long list of accomplishments. He has a company. He's the president of Liker Lean Advisors, and he's been a very prolific writer of some very, very well-known books, including The Toyota Way. We're also lucky to have Mike Rother here. Mike Rother is an engineer and an alum of the department, IOE alum, and he's a researcher and teacher who works to help people, teams, organizations, achieve their full potential. And he's author of the book Toyota Kata, which many of you may have read. I did, and I found it very, very interesting. And so we're delighted to have you here. And I'll turn things over to Mike Roth and Jeffrey Liker to take things from here. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us. As Brian said, and some of you know, I was a professor in IOE, actually starting in 1982. I got involved in a study comparing the US and Japan auto industry in 1983. And that ended up becoming the focus of my research and eventually teaching. I was unusual in that I started really in studying US-Japan differences in product process development, not manufacturing. And then it was later that I learned about manufacturing. And one of the ways I learned about the Toyota production system was working with Mike Rother and John Shook on a consulting project for Ford when they were trying to develop the Ford production system modeled after the Toyota production system. And over time, we created a course, IOE 425, about lean manufacturing, about manufacturing strategy that Deborah Leventrusser is teaching today. And in the last 3 years I was there, I retired 5 years ago after 35 years in the department. In my last 3 years, I was teaching a course called Lean Thinking, which Joy Lynn Mondisa is currently teaching, I think every other year. But that course was a transition for me rather than sort of end my career by petering down. I started something new. And that was based on what I learned from a former student of mine, Mike Rother, which he wrote about in Toyota Kata. And that's what I'll talk about today is the relationship between the Toyota Way and then Toyota Kata, and set the stage for Mike to talk in more detail about scientific thinking in Toyota Kata. Mike, do you want to say a few words?
Yes. Yeah, I wish we were in the department together or wherever these things are normally held when they're face-to-face, so we could see each other and have coffee and some kind of Zingerman's goodies, right, Betty? Yeah. But it's just been a pleasure. I didn't know when I came to U of M, it was like 1987 or so. We actually came to Ann Arbor to go to grad school. And I didn't know how rich the association with the university would be. And a large part of that is Jeff. Jeff was, Jeff and Walt Hancock were sort of the professors that took me under their arm. But it has just continued on. You often hear about the University of Michigan alumni network around the world, and it truly is large. But for me, it's been much more than that. There have been touch points with the university all the way through, and it's been a great pleasure. And Jeff, again, in considerable extent, thanks to you. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
So what I'm going to do is start with a presentation. We're going to try to keep these relatively short so we have time for question and answer. And again, I'm going to talk about more the relationship between the Toyota Way and Kata. As you might see the word second edition in the Toyota Way, I completely revised the Toyota Way after 17 years, and it continued to sell well for 17 years. But I really felt something was missing that I needed to add, and that was really based on learning from Mike about Toyota Kata, and that was the concept of scientific thinking. And Toyota Kata really is about developing a mindset and a way of thinking. Now, if you look at the history of lean, there was a point in the 1980s where it was viewed as a toolkit, and the big thing was just in time. And how can we bring material into the factory and then to the customer with as little inventory as possible? And that was sort of like the goal, like a race against time to try to reduce inventory. I had learned from Toyota that it was much more than that. And it was really a total look at the value stream from raw material to the customer, starting with the customer, and then trying to develop and deliver products that the customer wants and needs when they want it, in the amount they want. And every part of the enterprise really is geared toward doing that. The term lean thinking then came up in a book called Lean Thinking by Jim Womack and Dan Jones. And they said, this isn't really a methodology. It's not a set of tools. It's a way of thinking. And the way of thinking was largely that enterprise value stream view and then shrinking lead time. And it was really Mike's Toyota Kata that clarified for me that the way of thinking is really something even more fundamental, which is scientific thinking. And we'll be talking about that. First, starting with Toyota and their version of the Toyota Way, which I was able to study before I wrote the original Toyota Way. And they just describe it as the whole company revolves around two pillars: continuous improvement and respect for people. And for Toyota, respect for people is more than treating them fairly and treating them nicely, which is certainly part of it, but it's challenging them to grow. It's developing people. It's making people the best they can be. So investing in developing people is really central to Toyota, and they do more of it than any other company I know. You know, for example, if you are hired in to product development as an engineer, for the first year, you're just getting generic training in how to be an engineer, what the Toyota production system is, and you get immersed into things like selling cars at a dealership. And then you work on a project with a mentor, and in year two, you're a freshman, you're working on some specific project with a mentor, and then you work on a product development program. But by the time they say you're really an engineer, it takes about 6 years. So it takes longer to become an engineer in Toyota than it does to get your university degree. And they consider the university degree a starting point of creating good raw material. Continuous improvement is a philosophy that says that even if we want a breakthrough, like today, the future of mobility with self-driving cars and electric vehicles, we're going to achieve that breakthrough through many small steps. Continuously meaning that we level out the thinking and the planning and the doing. So we're doing something every day and not waiting for big milestones and then cramming before the test. And that something could be transformational for the whole company, led by the very top of the company. It could be led by middle management, for example, in a plant, in a department, or it could be on the front line, a group leader, team leader, and team members who have processes that they're trying to achieve targets for productivity, for quality, for safety. In every case, they're using the same way of thinking, the same meta approach to improvement, which Mike called scientific thinking, which is shown in the foundation of the Toyota Way. So the three elements that support continuous improvement are: first, challenge, which is having a clear direction, a clear purpose, and knowing why you're doing something and what you're trying to achieve within a time frame. Usually the challenges in Toyota are on an annual basis, and they have a process of Hoshinkanri, of deploying goals annually that set the challenge for everybody at all levels. And then when you have the challenge, you just know the direction. The immediate first step should be, where am I now? And they do that through going and seeing at what's called the Gemba, which is where the action is, where the work is being done, where the product is being used. So you go and you see and you observe directly and learn, and they place a high value on using all your senses to understand the current condition, not only statistics and data. And then you Kaizen. And Kaizen is often discussed as plan, do, check, act in the terms of Dr. Deming. And that is, you run experiments. You try it, you plan something, you try it, you check what happened, you reflect on what you learned, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and do it again toward in the direction of the challenge. So collectively, this is continuous improvement at Toyota, which happens to look a lot like the improvement kata that Mike developed. And it's not a coincidence, because Mike developed it first by studying Toyota, and particularly the master trainers of the Toyota production system within Toyota. So I revised the Toyota Way model. Originally, it was the 4 things you see, the 4 P's I called it, and it was a pyramid. And instead, I made it an interconnected system, but put scientific thinking in the center. And the starting point of scientific thinking is the philosophy. Toyota is always thinking long term, where we want to be in 2050 and 2035 and 2025. And they are thinking in system terms. So the Toyota production system, probably the most important word in that is system. So they will say doing one thing, like installing a Kanban system, so you're pulling inventory and reducing inventory, by itself is not very valuable. It's only in the context of a total system of delivering value to the customer. And the way you deliver value to the customer is through processes. And often we think of processes as something to implement, like I implement Kanban, I implement standard work, I implement visual management, whereas Toyota views them more as dependent variables, something to try to achieve. So I want to achieve delivery to the customer one piece at a time without waste. I want to, in order to do that, I need to create a situation where people are following the best known way of doing the work. And standard work is the way we document what we want the worker to be doing. And to get people to follow standard work, to do their best, and to continually improve, because every year you have a higher and higher goal, they need to invest in people, make them feel like, actually treat them genuinely as team members, not as disposable labor. And a lot of the training that's done is training in what Toyota calls problem solving, which is working scientifically toward a challenge. So at the center of all this is scientific thinking. And if you haven't developed people to think scientifically, and I'll define this and Mike will elaborate, if you haven't developed people to think scientifically, none of these other pieces will actually work in practice. Okay, so what is scientific thinking? And I got this from Mike, and Mike and I have been buddies for a while, probably interacting more since we've been talking about and learning about Toyota Kata than maybe we even did when I was at the University of Michigan as a student. And the first thing about scientific thinking is that we don't know what we think we know. We have some representation of reality in our brains that's very incomplete. And we tend to think it is reality. And we have to acknowledge we don't know anything. So for example, the first lesson, if you were to go to Teiichi Ono, the creator of the Toyota production system, was to stand in a circle for the entire day in one place in the factory and just look. And he would keep on asking you, challenge you to think some more about what you're thinking. And what he was trying to do is to get you to go below the surface of your first impressions and really look deeply and understand what was happening. The second point is that assume that our ideas for how to solve a problem are only ideas, and they may not work the way we think we're going to work. So we need to test our ideas in some way, not just theorize. So there's a lot of value in Toyota placed on learning by doing, not just for learning by debating, analyzing data, theorizing about what might happen if we try this. And then finally, appreciating learning from differences between what we predict and what actually happens. And this can be very difficult for humans. and we have a natural tendency to want to be right. And in fact, we will fight really hard to defend what we think is true. And what this is saying is a good scientific thinking means that if I predict something will happen and something different happens, I find that really interesting. It doesn't mean I'm dumb or I'm bad at my job. It means that the world is full of uncertainty. And one person said that the best single symbol to illustrate scientific thinking is a question mark. So it's a outlook of questioning and wondering what will happen, and then being interested to see what will happen. So I put this into the center of my model, and I still have 14 principles. Some of the principles are similar to what I had in the first book, for example, but they've been modified a bit. Like philosophy, I put the word systems thinking into the principle about philosophy, and I wasn't emphasizing it, I don't think, enough. And the system thinking is both the parts of the system, say inside an operation, like just in time. Part of that system is just in time working together with building in quality and stopping when there's a problem and working to stabilize processes. And then more broadly, recognizing that you live in a world and you affect the community and you have to understand what customers want. You have to understand trends in technology. And so there's a broader view of your impact on the world and the global community. And then processes haven't changed all that much but I've emphasized again in the processes that they're not something to implement, but rather something to strive for. Then for people, I've emphasized more developing people in scientific thinking. And Toyota's way of doing that is to sort of push you into the deep end of the pool and allow you to struggle with a coach watching you and giving you guidance. But the deep end of the pool is usually a challenge that at first seems impossible. Like improve productivity by 80%. And you have no idea how you could possibly do it. And then you start working at it, and they're guiding you mostly through questions and sometimes grunts and moans to let you know if you're off track. And lo and behold, maybe you didn't get to 80%, but you got to 78%. And then you still feel really bad because you didn't get to 80%. So what they're trying to teach is the fourth part, problem solving. And I've revised that the most. So 12 really deals with what Mike will talk about with the Kata, but it's really learning to observe deeply and learn iteratively, step by step toward the goal. Having a clear picture of your goals through aligned goals, and I talked about Hoshin-Conry, this method of deploying goals from the president of the company to everybody who's working in the company. And I've added a discussion of connecting this to your strategy for your product and your business model, and then connecting that to your execution. So I mentioned that lean processes are something to struggle toward, not something to implement. And in fact, mostly what makes the Toyota production system different than traditional manufacturing is that Toyota is trying to simplify and allow you to visualize the process. So for example, the idea of a pull system is that we make only what the customer needs, our next customer needs. And the model used for that originally was like selling milk in a grocery store, where you put out a certain amount of milk, the customer takes away milk, and then you replace what the customer takes away. The Kanban is ordering, I now want a new unit of milk because the customer has taken away a unit of milk. So the Kanban system has become very popular, and it's visual and it's cool looking because instead of schedules and computers, you're controlling production based on cards circulating around or some sort of signal. But the real purpose of Kanban was to make problems visible. So if I have a system where I have a card on a container, and then I move that container, and then when I start to use it, I take the card off, and I notice there's a card sitting in inventory that doesn't, a container sitting in inventory that doesn't have a card, I know there's a problem. If the customer's running out and a container is supposed to be coming, but it doesn't come, I know there's a problem. So this is making problems visible so that we can then solve the problems. And there's a lot of encouragement in Toyota to just try it. I don't know whether I should have 5 containers circulating or 4 containers or 3 containers. They might say, well, try 5. And if you've got 2 extra sitting in inventory not moving, then take 1 away and see what happens. A lot of emphasis on trial and error, but based on actual experience. And then the tools are simple tools to visualize. Here's what's happening. Here's where there's gaps and problems. When I try this, I can see what's happening, what the result is. And this is through Plan, Do, Check, Act, again, continuous improvement. And this was, it's given credit to Dr. Deming, who taught quality control, but it became a more general way of thinking, which is not just one big Plan, Do, Check, Act, where you plan a new technology, you implement the new technology, you check to confirm it works, and then you take further action based on what you learn, but rather you have a goal of achieving something with the new technology, and then you break that process of developing and introducing it into smaller steps. And from each step, you're doing Plan, Do, Check, Act, and running experiments and testing your ideas. So it becomes a wheel that's moving quickly, and you're constantly running experiments. So this is all good and well, and it makes sense. And I certainly, people in engineering are not going to argue against scientific thinking, and probably not argue against long-term thinking. But it turns out it's really difficult for us, not us non-engineers, but for us humans. We're not good at it. And the problem is that our brains, going back to primitive times and Darwinian survival of the fittest, were really designed for quick action and quick results to survive in the jungle. And we needed to know, not guess. And we needed to feel we were certain just to stay alive. Another problem is that our brain takes in a whole lot of information, but we can process only a tiny percentage of it at a time. So we can take in 11 million bits of information a second. We process 40 to 50 bits of information a second. So how do you deal with that tremendous loss of information? And that is to use existing frameworks, categories, to take the 40, 50 bits of information and try and generalize it to the 11 million bits. And we do that through various kinds of shortcuts, which are called biases. And in psychology and behavioral economics, they've documented hundreds of these biases. One, for example, is confirmation bias, which is that when we have made a decision or committed to a course of action, we will tend to only look for evidence to support that we were right, both before we take the action and after we take the action. And if you criticize me and because it didn't work right, I'll argue with you, I'll defend myself, and I'll become even more locked in to my prior belief. Again, this is just one of many biases, but it prevents us from thinking scientifically. So our tendency is to just want to do stuff that we are confident is right and not test our ideas, not do much planning, not learn from our experiments. So this is the model Mike developed that he'll be talking more about. And in some ways, it's very simple. There's 4 high-level steps. One is you have to know where you're trying to get to. So the direction or challenge needs to be clear. It's surprising how often that's not clear, and people are just doing stuff. Like in Lean, they're implementing Kanban, implementing standards work, they're doing 5S and cleaning up the workplace, but they don't know why they're doing it or what they're trying to accomplish. This is intended to be a big challenge, a stretch beyond what you think is possible today. Then you start to understand the current condition. By start, I mean the current condition is something dynamic and changing all the time. So you don't want to spend a huge amount of time collecting all sorts of data, analyzing all sorts of data. As I mentioned, I taught, at the time it was IOE 591. It was a new course and I called it Lean Thinking. And I used this model. And a natural tendency of my very bright master students was to want to collect statistical data and analyze the heck out of it. And I had to stop them and say, enough. You have a great understanding of everything that might have happened in the past. But what we're trying to do is move forward. What is your target condition? What are you trying to accomplish this semester? Will it be a successful outcome? And then start trying things, start experimenting. And once they started experimenting, then they didn't want to stop experimenting. And then the challenge was that we talk about the experiment, not in real formal terms like design of experiments, but rather at least understand what you're testing and what you think will happen when you test your idea. Then after running the test, reflect back, look at data to see what happened, and then finally ask yourself, what did I really learn from this? So once the students got involved in experimenting, they would tend to forget to predict what was going to happen and to reflect on what was going to happen, and they wanted to run the next experiment. So I found that it was actually quite challenging to teach these smart scientific thinking students this way of scientific thinking, but they got a lot out of it. The course evaluation is really good, and the students felt like they had really changed their mindset in some important ways. Okay, so this is what we call iterative learning. So instead of trying to jump to the challenge with one big idea, you're learning your way iteratively by trying a lot of ideas and learning from each experiment. And I've been kind of pushing what's on the right here, this adaptiveness model of lean, that lean is about adapting to change, testing hypotheses, learning by doing, wondering what's going to happen. But the way lean is often implemented is much more mechanistically. Here's my plan for lean deployment. Here's the tools of lean that I'm going to roll out as quickly as possible, get quick measurable results. And there's a feeling that I know what's going to happen when I implement these tools because I've done it before. This should work. In a lot of discussions with Mike, we came to the conclusion this is more like the yin and the yang. And that there are some things you know that are within your threshold of knowledge that you can implement maybe relatively quickly. What's going to usually happen if I say take a week and do a Kaizen workshop and change a bunch of things is that I'll get some positive results, but I'll also destabilize the process. There'll be things people don't know how to use. They don't know how to follow the standard work. And in following that, they'll need to adapt and learn through experimentation. Excuse me. So these things actually can go hand in hand, where sometimes you're implementing something known and sometimes you're experimenting. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike to pick up on the Kata and where he started.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me go to sharing my screen. Boom. All right. Jeff, do you see my screen?
Yes, it's perfect.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Okay. That was great, Jeff. I like the yin and yang at the end. What's the definition of intelligence? Being able to hold two conflicting thoughts in your mind at one time. I like that idea, that it's neither nor, it's both. So we were getting a thumping sound in there somewhere. I don't know.
Probably me.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, you were keeping good time. I mean, you know, with the foot tapping. Jeff is a musician in addition to a researcher. I see we have Prakash with us. Hi, Prakash. I haven't seen you in a long time. And of course, Chris Conrad is there, secretly runs the whole shooting match. Good to see you too. I may have to scamper through some of these slides kind of quickly. Presenting this comes together with Jeff, comes as kind of an opportune moment because next week is the European Kata, and I have to give a presentation there. And it's been about a year since I've actually given a presentation. So I put something new together, and this is my test run of that. So I've tried to whittle it down a little bit, but I think I have a little too much here for the time allotted. So again, Brian, I apologize in advance, and I may have to skip over a few slides If anyone wants the slides, I'm happy to send them to you, Brian, and anyone who wants them can then have the PowerPoint file if they'd like to use it. So let's see. I like this sentence. Enjoy discovering the world beyond your perception of it. This is not a sentence I would have enjoyed when I was a younger person. This is a sentence that would have bothered me, that the world as I perceived it was the world as I believed it was. And I like to be certain about that. And Jeff, listening to you present, you talked about the Toyota's way involving discovery and learning. And I noticed that we use the same word there. Enjoy discovering the world beyond your perception of it. So I agree, that's a lot of what Toyota's management system and what they teach their people is about. So let me see, how do I advance slides like that? Okay. So what I want to present is a way of thinking and working that, and it takes some practice. If you practice it, it helps your organization, it helps your team, and it helps you personally deal with uncertainty and to achieve challenging goals along uncertain paths, which kind of defines life. It's also, and this may sound kind of silly, but I found this to be true, it's also a way of thinking that helps you have a wonderful, interesting, meaningful life. And it involves developing some of these basic, practical, everyday scientific thinking skills. Call them habits if you want. It's habit development, skill development. And anyone can develop those skills through a little bit of daily practice, simple daily practice. Let me start with this. I'm going to start with a little bit of a downer. So basically, we're stuck here, and we're stuck here forever on the planet. It's a nice planet. It gets worse. We are limited to the surface of this planet. We can't live underground, not for any length of time, and we can't live more than about 5,000 meters up. I think the highest human settlement, long-term settlement, is in Peru, and it's 5,100 meters. We can't really live for any length of time beyond that. If you do a little math, that's 55 football fields. So basically, your life is going to be spent in a layer that's 55 football fields thick, and that's it. So colonizing another planet, we talk a lot about living on Mars, or frankly, jetpacks, getting jetpacks so we can zoom around at will, you know, up there. Probably not going to happen. Probably not. Prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. Let's see. It gets even worse. If that weren't enough of a constraint that we live in this thin little layer on this planet, we're also stuck with a biased jump to conclusions brain. And what I mean by that is we don't see reality. Our brain is connected to our eyes and the other senses through wires or nerves, not through tubes that see the outside world. So basically, the brain is getting little dots and dashes, little electrical impulses, and it has to decide, what do those impulses mean? So when we look at something, the brain gets a little bit of input, and it has to quickly decide, what am I seeing? And it tells you then what you're seeing. This is a good example, this photo here, where the brain makes an error. We see something, but it's not what's actually happening. So the brain gets these electrical signals and uses them to tell us what's going on out there. And what happens is that we never really have full information, and the brain is constantly jumping to conclusions. Frankly, we never have full information, and we need to know pretty fast. If you're driving, if you're walking along, if something's happening, there's not a lot of time for your brain to ruminate about what might this data coming in be about. It has to decide really quickly for our safety. So it's constantly jumping to conclusions. And the way it jumps to conclusions, by the way, you have an engineer talking about the brain now, so take it with a grain of salt. The way it jumps to these conclusions is it gets these dots and dashes coming in from the senses, and it compares that to a library that you've built up, kind of a reference library that you've built up over time based on your experiences starting as a child. So the particular neural library that you've built up from your childhood drives how you perceive and react to the world. And the brain does this, you'll notice it says, quickly and silently. It's not telling you that it's jumping to these conclusions. It's got to do it instantly, and it's got to do it very quietly. Your brain doesn't say to you, I don't know what that is. Hold, please, gather more data. Let's do an analysis here. It decides really quickly what something out there is, and it gives you a feeling of certainty that you know what that is. Now, it works pretty well. It works pretty well. Most of the time, the brain's jumping to conclusions all the time. So you look at a coffee cup, the brain gets the data, gets those electrical impulses and says, yeah, that's a coffee cup, right? Pretty good. Now the coffee cup could be hot, there could be something in it, who knows, we don't know that yet. But by and large, that worked, right? We see the coffee cup. But there's a lot of stuff where the brain doesn't know, but it still jumps to the conclusion. We don't know what's at the end of that road. We don't know what's coming next. So as a result of this jump to conclusions mechanism, which is very handy to have, gets us through. But as a result of this mechanism, at all times, all of the following are potentially biased and unreliable. That's your assumptions, your opinions, your perceptions, your memory, your perspectives. All of that is potentially biased. So that's the end of my presentation. I wish I had better news, but basically we're tapping around in the dark with a sensory system that distorts. And I'm sorry to be the bringer of bad news. So Brian, I'm sorry. I probably should have warned you that this was going to be kind of a downer. So. But wait a minute. Let's wait a minute. Here's the cool thing. In that thin little layer that we live in on the surface of this planet, there is an infinite, a lifetime worth of things for you to discover right here in that thin layer. And that's what I mean by an interesting, enjoyable, fun, satisfying life. And I think one key to that meaningful life, to your success as an organization, your success as a team, I like the team level, your success as an individual, is to get good at the process of discovering the reality beyond your current perceptions. Your brain's doing what it can, it's getting you through, but there's a lot more to discover out there. And surprise is not a word that you often hear in the business world. It's not perceived as a positive thing in the business world, but it's a lot of what this is about. And a lot of what adaptiveness and resilience builds on is being able to utilize surprise to your advantage. And with some practice, and a lot of what Jeff and I are talking about here is about practice, with practice, it even becomes fun. And that's what Toyota Kata is about. The research was done in production settings. It started looking at production systems, but I think where it's taken me at this point, the Toyota Kata book came out in 2009, so it's about 12 years ago. At this point, it's taken me to a broader plane. Let's take a look at Toyota Kata. Real quick, there were two research questions back earlier part of this century. Question one, what are the unseen managerial routines and thinking that lie behind Toyota's success with continuous improvement and adaptation? Second question, okay, if we can figure that out, what's some of this unseen stuff? What are they doing in their management system? If we can figure that out, the second question becomes, well, how can other companies do that? Right? How can they develop similar routines and thinking in their organizations? You may be wondering why Toyota. I saw someone chatted that they love Toyota. It is an interesting company. It caught our attention for a number of reasons. One of them is 60 years of profitability. That's pretty unusual. It keeps improving. And maybe even the most interesting, they seem to be able to keep an inventive entrepreneurial mindset going, even in a mature company. And that's a rarity. A lot of what Jeff and I studied, particularly at the beginning, related to their production system. It has since expanded more into, process, product development, and so forth and so on. But we did start by looking at the production system, and again, that fit well with IOE. There were three phases of the research. Number one, it's pretty obvious. Number one, you study how Toyota managers operate and think. Not so easy, since thinking is invisible. Dropping down from that, you try to describe that. I described it in two different models. And that first arrow should go back and forth. There's kind of a back and forth between studying, trying to figure it out, making a model, studying it, trying to make a model. Eventually the model kind of starts to stops oscillating, and you have what you think is a pretty good model. The third layer of the Toyota Kata research was to develop starter Kata practice routines that others can use to develop similar skills and thinking in their organizations. And that one, the first two layers are pretty standard for research. The third part, these starter kata practice routines, that's kind of born out of the realization of how we learn new skills and habits. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So question one, what are these unseen managerial routines and thinking that lie behind their success? These were the findings. There's visible stuff at Toyota, their results, their lean tools and techniques that you can see if you visit a Toyota facility. And by what we found was some less visible stuff, 2 points here. One is kind of a systematic scientific way of thinking and acting, a practical everyday way, scientific way of thinking and acting. And that's a lot of what Jeff was talking about. And number two, that the managers are kind of the coaches. They're the teachers of that way. That way is not natural to us humans. Our natural way is to jump to conclusions and be pretty certain about those conclusions, which is not very scientific. So there has to be a conscious effort to teach a scientific thinking, and that's the role of the line managers at Toyota. What's kind of interesting about the bottom part of this diagram, the blue part, the less visible stuff, is that while the top is Toyota specific, if you visit Toyota and look at their specific solutions, Jeff mentioned Kanban and so forth, those are Toyota specific things. But what you see in the blue box down below is not Toyota specific. That can actually be used everywhere. And that's where we went. This led to the two models. Jeff talked about the improvement kata model. It's just a 4-step model of how they tend to think. There's also a coaching kata model I won't go into. George Box said all models are wrong, some are useful. These models are simply an attempt to describe what we found. And each manager will have their own style. But if you look long enough, they tend to think and act this way. And these are, ultimately you get this sort of aha moment. You say, oh, you know what? These are actually scientific thinking patterns. That does raise the question, what do we mean by scientific thinking? And Jeff already covered this really well. It's a great way of approaching situations, goals, and problems, acknowledging that you don't have full information, you never have full information. Number two, as Jeff pointed out, assuming that we're going to find answers by trying things and seeing what happens. And the third one is the tough one, appreciating, and I chose that word on purpose, appreciating that if there's a difference between what you thought would happen and what actually happens, that you're going to learn from that. And that's actually useful. And I can't say that I love the third one. I still get a kind of a disappointed feeling when I have an idea in my head and I try and it doesn't work out. But usually shortly thereafter, I'm like, okay, great. Reality has spoken. This is the kind of thinking that we found Toyota and Toyota managers are trying to instill in their people because it's powerful thinking. With this thinking, imagine if everyone thought like this on the planet. Imagine what we could achieve. And again, notice that none of this on this slide is Toyota specific, right? This is useful because of the way our brain works, everybody's brain. So what's different about scientific thinkers? Okay, children, I think you can probably remember this in your lifetime. Children think their beliefs are mental copies of reality. What you're seeing is reality, what you're thinking is reality. If I close my eyes, you can't see me, that kind of thing. As adults, of course, we realize that our mental representations are not necessarily matching external reality, right? But a scientific thinker goes one step further. It's like an extra bit. And they utilize the difference between what their brain is thinking and what reality shows them by and by, unfolding reality. And they use the comparison between those two to learn, and as Jeff said, to iterate their way forward. A scientific thinker is not immune to fear. If you throw a scientific thinker a challenge, they will go, oh boy, that's kind of scary. I'm not sure how we're going to do that. And as I just mentioned, I think a scientific thinker will be disappointed if their thoughts or their hypotheses are refuted. But then they pretty quickly say, okay, what am I learning? How do I need to adjust? And how do I go forward based on that? What this is navigating with a compass instead of a map. If you have a map, that's great. But in many situations, and perhaps more in the 21st century than in the 20th century, or at least the latter half of the 20th century, We don't have maps. So scientific thinking, as Jeff and I are describing it here, could be one of the, maybe the best means we currently have for navigating through complex, dynamic, unpredictable territory. And again, I mean that in your business organization, your business team, but frankly, also in your personal life. Here's kind of the engineering trap in the bottom part. We have a lot of knowledge. We have tables of speeds and feeds and so forth, and we can look these things up. Others have gone before us and figured these things out. And we should definitely use that knowledge. It's not like you have to start from zero every time. But when you take existing knowledge and apply it in a new situation, it may or may not work the same way. There's no guarantee that past experiences will be consistent with future situations. So yes, let's have this existing knowledge, but let's also have the skill to use that knowledge and iterate our way forward. I think we get into trouble if we rely too much on, we know, we have it, we can look it up, we calculated it. Okay, we calculated it, let's see what happens when we apply it in the real world. Just keep that mind open a little bit. And Jeff mentioned meta, and this is the cool part. Scientific thinking is content neutral. So this is an excellent thing to teach. It's an excellent thing to practice. It's an excellent thing to teach to children because it's content neutral. We do not know what we'll be facing in the future. The children in our grade school classes, the college students in our classes, we don't know what they're going to face. So how useful to teach a meta skill that's content neutral with which they can find their own way in whatever situations they're faced with. Here's kind of a Homer Simpson dope slap moment I've had. Planning is important, but here's an interesting thing to keep in mind. When you make your plan, you are at the point of maximum uncertainty about how that trip will go. And that was the Homer dope Simpson. Tomorrow, after you've taken the first step, you'll know more. So planning is important, but don't get too hung up on then the plan being the map. You're going to know more tomorrow. So basically, you iterate your way forward, you have an expectation, then you see what actually happens. Possibly you learn something. What you're doing, in effect, is poking reality. Since we can't really see reality, we try something and we poke reality, and because reality reacts, it reveals itself a little bit to us. And what we learn from it revealing to ourselves, we can use to inform our next step. So you're basically reassessing at each landing zone. The second research question, how can other companies develop similar routines and thinking in their organizations? How do you develop that useful thinking? It's not our default thinking, scientific thinking. This runs into something some people call the information action fallacy. And it's an idea that if we share information, it will lead to change thinking. If we share enough information, if we make a convincing argument, if we have a good research model, we write a good book, that will change how people think and act. And it's just not how the brain works. Models alone don't change behavior. It takes deliberate practice. Scientific thinking ain't difficult, but you do have to practice it. And these are some ingredients of deliberate practice. This kind of represents what you'll see a Toyota manager working with. He or she's coaching their people. The practice is frequent, a little bit every day. It's better to practice a little every day than a lot once a week or once a month, and so forth and so on. So various ingredients of deliberate practice. So what we did, and this was the third phase of the research, we took our model and then we developed starter practice routines for each step of the model and called them starter kata. These starter kata are not from Toyota. They're a mechanism to try to make the findings that we have transferable. And here are some people practicing various starter kata. You don't practice them all at once. They build on them over time, and then eventually they develop their own style. This is one of the best illustrations I've found for the role of starter kata. These simple, very focused, structured practice routines you practice at the beginning. See on the left-hand side in the swimming pool, the coach is having everybody do the same thing. And you can just about hear the swimmers going, I don't want to practice my kick. I want to swim. You'll be able to swim in the future, but first you got to get these fundamental routines, these fundamental skills down. And then you can see as the learner progresses, eventually in the right end of the pool, everyone develops their own style. The coach is merely watching. but you had to kind of get through that initial practice. That's what the starter kata are for. Let me skip over this one. And I just want to say that the workplace is an excellent place to practice. So a lot of you have a workplace or will be going to a workplace. You've got real goals and problems there to work on. There are people who can coach one another, and it's daily. You'll be there every day, at least I think so, sometime in the future again. You're there every day. So it's an excellent place to practice. And here's what happens. This is a recent tweet. Someone from a workplace tweeted, "Today, a team member brought in a container from home to try out in a process. I asked if he was thinking in the improvement kata steps outside of work in this scientific thinking pattern. His answer, I am thinking like this everywhere." And this is what happens. We can practice in the workplace because it's a great place to practice. And then it spreads to your team members' everyday life. So I'd like to end here. You can make your workplace, your team, a place, a force for positive change. So I invite you to turn your team or your workplace into a forum for practicing practical everyday scientific thinking, which then spills over into society as people take home the scientific skill and mindset that they acquired at work and apply it to the various issues in their personal life, and ultimately to raising and teaching their own children. So this is kind of the arc that Toyota has gone from studying Toyota's production system and how come they keep improving it and how do they keep this entrepreneurial mindset going even in a mature company to, wow, this is a lever with which we can achieve almost anything we want beyond the workplace as well.
Wonderful. Well, I want to take an opportunity to thank Jeff and Mike for a very stimulating presentation. On behalf of everybody in IOE and everybody here, thank you so much for sharing some of your ideas and thoughts and some of your time with us.